Hey, what's up, man? We out here out front, the gateway into Andrews University, but it's a Sabbath. And I'm here this morning because I led out in Sabbath school for Genesis, one of our campus fellowships here. This is the church group that I'm helping as one of the assistant pastors for. Hashtag if you know, you know. But something that's really been cool about this opportunity and being involved in church here is this teaching aspect. And to be honest, I love teaching a lot. I love learning a lot, really. And I think that's what comes behind the love for the teaching aspect of it, because it's so much fun to be able to share things that you get to learn. And it's a little bit different than just preaching when you're kind of speaking at people. I prefer the teaching because it's a lot more interchange. There's dialogue, there's back and forth, and there's questions, not rhetorical questions that you get to pose out there and then answer for yourself, but questions that you get to genuinely explore with the people who are in the classroom. We decided to name the Sabbath School Genesis Meets Genesis. And I thought this was a really unique opportunity and approach because a couple things that we get to address with this name is it's the Genesis community, but we're actually going to be studying through the book of Genesis. So Genesis literally meets Genesis. We have the community meeting with the ancient biblical text on one hand, but on the other hand, we're looking to see how we can connect the truths and the lessons from the ancient text into modern life. So we want to bring what's in the past back here into the present in a practical way so that we can apply it. If you've heard me in any of my videos before, you'll hear me say a lot about the practicality of spirituality. That to me is the key. Growing up, just in short, I'm gonna keep this brief. Growing up, I did not see the practicality in spirituality. It was just things that we are supposed to do because we're supposed to do them. I didn't see the connection between real life. That might be on me. It's probably a lot on me and my lack of appreciation for the way and the things I was being taught. So I ended up distancing myself from Christianity and Adventism as a result. But because of service and the mission mentality that I was able to gain from being in Palau for a number of years, that's what helped me to see the connection and why this stuff matters, why it's applicable, and how it can have a real, genuine meaning for a personal experience, and why I believe as a result that Christianity and Adventism is worth it. So, folding all that back into this, when we get the context of Genesis and bringing that ancient text to modern life, I think there are so many things that we can gain as a blessing for ourselves practically today, even things that we might take for granted or may just miss because of the way it's been presented. So the goal here is to provoke thought in a way that helps us to see this as a practical practical application as opposed to just something that's historical and something that we read. I'm gonna be referring to my notes here. I got my laptop right here and going through this. So we'll be bouncing some things back and forth in this video, but this is going to be the introduction. We've had 3 lessons so far. Today was the 3rd one. And just because of the way that time works out, I mean, over the course of the semester, we're already in March. We basically done like once a month, but today was our 3rd one. We've had 2 other ones so far. The first one was just on introducing the concept of Genesis and why it mattered, especially for the context of the Israelites. So we're going to take a look at that now. So if we're talking about Genesis, we have to start with the most basic of the basics. We're talking about the first book in the Bible, the first book in the Pentateuch, the first book that was written by Moses, as many believe. But even more basic than that, you have the name Genesis, the word Genesis. What does it mean? Where did it come from? Well, what is Genesis? It's actually a Greek word that means origin, source, generation, or beginning. The original Hebrew title Bereshith means in the beginning, which is reflective of the first few words of the text. So it makes sense. It tracks. But the question is, why Genesis and why here? Because the beginning, well, we'll get into that a little bit later. I'm getting ahead of myself. I get excited with this stuff. I'll say this. Contextually, what I mean by that question is, why was it given at this time? Because the book of Genesis was not given in the beginning, but it tells us about the beginning, right? With the classic understanding that Moses, the author of this book, Who are the people that lived in his time? Who are the people that he would have been writing to? Who would have been the first recipients of the text and when? All of these things are factors that help us to understand why Genesis, why here, and why it's so important. When we look at Genesis as an origin story given in the context of the Israelite people, think about where they're coming from probably right before they're hearing this. We threw the question out in the Bible study, and it's like, well, Moses probably would have written these things maybe in the wilderness while he was leading, maybe after he had some assistance from Jethro's advice to help lead the people. He probably had some time in the mountain with God. Maybe he was getting this inspiration in writing these texts. So the children of Israel really are just coming out of the Exodus before they're getting exposed to Genesis. All right. And I think that's a really key distinction, because their experience coming out of slavery, 400 years of slavery in Egypt, going through seeing these 10 plagues, these miraculous, strange things happen, to going through the Red Sea, being delivered from Pharaoh and the army. All of these things are setting a background to why this story of origin is going to be so important and impactful for Israel. And I think that's one of the things I want to emphasize. We tend to look at the Bible only in the lens of what it means for me today. But in reality, if I want to get the best understanding, you can get an understanding of what the Bible is saying if you just try to pull directly and say, well, this means this for me today. But I would argue that if you want to get the best understanding of what the Bible means in an applicable way, and probably the most beneficial application of what the Bible means for you today, it's going to come from the context that it was given back then. Context is key. Context is everything. All right. So as I mentioned, it's commonly believed that Moses is the author of Genesis, even though Genesis actually doesn't directly name its author. And although the end of Genesis, which ends with the story of Joseph, even though those stories would have ended a few hundred years before Moses was even born, that's the classical belief that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. Mosaic authorship, I think there's internal evidence and even external evidence. I won't get into all the details with that, but feel free to look it up. Please don't take my word for any of this. The bottom line is all of church history is unified in the belief and the thinking that Moses was the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch. Flashback, senior class, if you know, you know. But again, all of these things are to highlight the point that even though Genesis is telling a story of beginnings, it was not given in the beginning. All right. That's a key distinction with some nuance there, but understand it. They're receiving the story of beginnings years after the beginning actually happened. OK, again, I think this highlights this concept that the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. Short tangent here. I've heard a lot of times people look at inspired writings and say, like, it's a letter to me, God's love letter to me, or they'll phrase it in a whole lot of other different ways. When it comes to prophecy, they might have direct applications and things they try to pull. But a lot of people look at it as if it's being written directly to us. And I don't think that that's true, at least in the sense that they usually mean it. For example, if someone is saying in Ezekiel or a prophet somewhere about he did something and he had to cut this up and do this to that person or whatever, there are people out there who will say, well, because we believe in this thing literally, I have to take this and it means that I have to do the same thing today. And what that does is take an idea out of its context, of its original context, and try to transplant it into the present. And it doesn't work. You end up with a lot of things that don't make sense and just don't work, because if you don't know what it meant to the people back then, how could you possibly know what the principle is and how to apply the principle then here in present day? I don't believe that you can. So understanding that Genesis and most of these books of the Bible were not written to us, understanding the people and the context in which they were written and the people who they were written for, helps us to understand why these words, or what the words might have meant to those people, what the point the author was trying to get across in that time is, and then we can draw and apply the principle. The principle, in our terms and in our language, in our culture today. Now, the reason I think that this is so important is because we have to realize this story of origin that's being shared here, that Moses is writing under the inspiration of God and giving to the Israelites, immediately in their context, it's coming into conflict with several other worldviews. It's coming into conflict with the Egyptian worldview, the stories of origin from an Egyptian perspective and religious perspective. And not only that, but the other various worldviews and origin myths and stories that would have existed at the time. So this is coming into the mix as something that's now a competing narrative with these other stories. It isn't just something that everyone might have assumed from the beginning. It's just, this is it, and that's the only story. That's kind of how we look at it, because we read it now from just the beginning. It's like we're starting the book, so that's all that there was. But again, understanding that this group of Israelite people that Moses is writing directly to, they've come through a whole lot of history before getting to this point where they received this text. Who knows how familiar they were? Who knows exactly what the oral history was and how solidified it had been during this time? I would argue that the internal evidence of the book shows us that a lot of this stuff was lost because God had to reestablish who he was with his own people. The plagues were not just a show of who God was for the Egyptians, but also for Israel. And there's a lot of things that qualify this, as we'll see as we go through the study. The story of Genesis, the origin story of Genesis, we've already said that it probably wasn't the first one to exist. Oral history wise, it probably was. But as people, you have the Tower of Babel, you have the division of people and languages and all this kind of stuff. You have a number of different stories that would start to pop up all over the ancient Near Eastern world, right? You have the Babylonian Enuma Elish, dated to around 1750 BC. And in this epic, the god Marduk creates the world through violence, forming it from the body of the slain goddess Tiamat. All right. And if Tiamat sounds familiar, it means you've been tuned into the MCU, because that's the celestial that's somewhere in the Indian Ocean right now, apparently, according to the MCU timeline. But it's funny because a lot of that stuff that they talk about in the movies, it actually came from the Bible, interestingly. You also have the Egyptian, their creation myth, the Heliopolis myth. This one features the god Atum emerging from chaos to create other gods and the world. You have the Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic. This is one of the other more well-known ones. This describes creation as not that one. It describes the creation of humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. Okay. And then you have the Sumerian creation myth from Eridu, which describes creation emerging from a primordial sea. Sounds familiar, right? There's a lot of similarity around these, especially in terms of chaos, violence, this kind of battling between the gods, these types of things. And, it makes sense, in a sense, that you have people who are just trying to figure out where they came from. They know that they're there. Obviously, they know that they're present. They're experiencing things that they identify as being supernatural, and they're trying to put all the pieces together. So a lot of stories come up contextually from where these people are and how they're seeing the world. Even the story of Noah, which we would determine as a biblical story, has several different versions that pop up as a part of these other mythologies and histories of different types of people. Variations of that story are popping up. So it's not new. But the bottom line is, these were the competing beliefs in that day. This is the world that the Genesis origin story is being dropped into. And it's interesting because a lot of critics believe that the Bible must have been a copy because these other stories that were probably in existence historically before the Genesis narrative was actually written down and dropped into history there. And it's at this point that I have to give a shout out to Wesley Huff. Was watching a couple of his videos and his debate with Billy Carson. Man, it was probably a couple months ago now. But I love the way that he broke things down and spoke out against the kind of misstatements and just untrue things that Billy Carson was throwing out here. Wesley Huff described a lot of biblical things very well. I'll leave it at that. Go check out his video, though. Check out that debate because I thought it was pretty legit. Now, these are the competing belief systems in the day, right? But despite kind of the similarities of things like language. The reason I brought up Billy Carson is because he's one that will say that because the Bible has this language and because these other written things existed first, that it was a copy and that there's no way it could be legit. So there are similarities there when it comes to things like the mention of the waters and different elements. There are similarities, all right? We cannot escape the fact that there are similarities between these other creation myths and stories and narratives and the origin story in Genesis. There are similarities there. But despite those similarities, especially when you're considering probably the two major of these creation myths, the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic, there are huge differences that literally make all the difference. For example, if you look at the key differences between the origin story of Genesis and these other two, you have the idea of monotheism versus polytheism. You have this war of the gods and destruction resulting in this kind of afterthought of a creation that happens in comparison to a god or a godhead that is responsible for creation. A lot of the other myths even mention these other gods as being created kind of out of the primordial matter and coming into their own type of new existence. But the second one, I think, might be one of the bigger ones. It's regarding the actual method of creation. See, if you remember how the simple breakdowns of these numerous other creation stories, a lot of them had that violence, that chaos that was present there that resulted in the creation. And accident is kind of the word I would use, where it's not just that there's chaos and the primordial waters and this confusion that is there, but it's that as a byproduct of these things happening, oh, now you have the world and now you have humans. That's completely different than in Genesis. Yes, you do have the primordial waters, you do have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, but you have a lot more intention in the story of creation that is there. And that's significant for one huge reason. If the origin story of Genesis shows creation as being an ordered process, something that's done through peaceful, divine speech and method, there's control there. There's not a lack of chaos and just random and no byproduct. There's intention there. And this is all in comparison and contrast to these other creation stories that display this leftover result of violence, these war of the gods type scenarios, and the remnant or what's left ends up just resulting in humanity existing. There's a huge difference there. And I think the biggest thing is that it tells us that there's a difference in the intention and purpose of humanity itself. Human purpose. How many times have people said, like, know your purpose, find your worth, your value, know your value? You hear this kind of messaging all the time, but what's the reason for it? Depending on where you come from, has a huge impact on what you believe about your worth and your purpose. In the Genesis origin story, we have creation that's done with intention that results in a humanity that's here for a reason, which means that inherently every human has value and has purpose, created in the image of God. This is a big deal. It's a big deal. And if we know that we have this purpose based on believing in that worldview, then it means a lot for me in the present here today. By contrast, if I believe in some of these other worldviews and believe that the existence of humanity and even our world is just a byproduct of some accident, what does that say for my value? What does it say for my worth? And what does it say for my purpose? There's no intention there, so the value can't be that serious. It can't be that much. It doesn't say much for my worth because, again, I'm an accident. And especially when it comes to purpose, what purpose does an accident have? There is none. There is none. So depending on where you start, right? It has huge bearing and impact on how we view ourselves here today. And people don't want to talk about that difference, but that's the biggest one, I think, that comes out of all of this. A lot of the other ones are theological and up for debate, but you cannot argue from a very practical standpoint that depending on what you believe in terms of our origin, It has everything to do with the value, the worth, and the purpose that we see in ourselves today. Were we made with intention or are we an accident? It speaks volumes to the difference. Genesis shows humans as being created in the image of God to serve with dignity, right? But on the other hand, a lot of these other creation stories describe humans as a divine afterthought. What a statement, a divine afterthought that was meant to just serve without feeling, without whatever. It's just, you're just meant to serve the gods, period. Like that's the purpose of your afterthought existence. Ain't nobody trying to do that. You have the themes of order versus chaos and the method of creation that's done, of course. We talked about that already. And then you have the cosmic view, to where a lot of different religions, ancient religions, deified nature. And the Genesis origin story, by contrast, actually demythologizes, is that right? Demythologizes, that's what it is. Demythologizes nature to where the sun is not the God, the moon is not the God, but there is a God who created those things and put those things in place. So again, big difference. Now, we're thinking about Israel, and they're receiving this cross-cultural view, this view of origin that is completely different than anything that they've been exposed to over the 400 years of their slavery and even beyond, right? Why would this be important, and what would this tell us about God? What would it tell them about God? And by extension, what does it tell us about us? Very much so, it's a countercultural approach to God himself, because of the two different sides that we've talked about here, the two different types of origins, the Genesis and the other one on the other side, the other types on the other side. Which of these gods would you feel like you could connect with? Well, on one hand, you have a God who created you with intention, on purpose, for a purpose. And on the other hand, you have a divine afterthought. Are you going to be more willing to consider connecting with the one who put you here for a reason? Or are you going to want to connect more with the one who you only exist because you were an accident because of something they were doing? To me, it seems pretty obvious what the choice is, right? But again, depending on where you come from, you may not even see that as an option. You might not even view God in a way that you can have a connection with him based on your starting point. And the reason I think this principle is so valuable and so important is because Israel needed to understand all of that back then in their time and in their context. They were coming right out of Egypt in a situation to where they were treated as if they didn't have any purpose outside of just slaving and serving away for Egyptian whatever. They were just looked at as mules, workhorses with no kind of value. The baby boys were killed, similar to what happened in Jesus' time. The baby boys were killed because they wanted to try to weaken the people. And it's crazy the things that they would do. What kind of perspective and worldview was influencing that? And what does Israel think about themselves as they're going through that? You know what I'm saying? So it's totally different relationship wise with the people and God, and how Israel would have seen themselves because of this worldview and its impact and pressure and its what's the word I'm looking for? My goodness. It's oppression on them. We'll say it that way. But again, if we understand that context for them back then, we can apply it to ourselves here today. Now, we won't hear as many people talking about, hey, I believe in the Enuma Elish, or hey, I believe in the Atrahasis epic. We might not hear that. But in terms of origin stories, we do have evolution, which is a much more recent development time-wise regarding origin of species, right? We have all of these things. But again, the same issue, the same thing that Genesis as an origin story speaks to for Israel back then, it can speak the same thing to us here today. Because look, if we believe in evolution, the theory of evolution that many try to pose as a fact, if we believe in that, then humanity doesn't have any intention. It was not created on purpose. There is no inherent value. It's not given or derived from anything else. It's something that is just, it's vague. It doesn't exist. And you have to try to figure out what that is. That's why something like survival of the fittest becomes the method, and natural selection, because, well, the other people don't matter. If they didn't make it, they didn't make it. That's a harsh way to live. And let's be real. Like, most of us would not want to live and exist that kind of way, even if you do believe it. Trust, like, you'll be talking about natural selection and survival of the fittest as long as you're the fittest. But the moment that you're not, you ain't trying to believe that anymore. Be real. Be real. But in contrast to that rivaling theory, you look at a world that a majority of people do believe that way. So going back to the questions about worth and value and purpose and why are we here, that we continue to hear people talk about and ask these questions for. There's something in the Genesis origin story that speaks directly to that. And I think it's something that people need to know and that people are looking for, even if they wouldn't realize that's the source and that's where it's coming from. Because we have these different ideas and theories out there that are distorting and disputing the perspectives and the existence of God. We have the same issues. We're dealing with the same issues, the same identity crisis that Israel was dealing with back then. We're dealing with the same thing here now. Because when you debate and when you dispute the existence of a God who's creating with intention, what you're really debating and what you're really disputing is our purpose, our value, the intention behind our existence. That's what's being debated. That's what's being disputed. And I don't think that is something that you can dispute or should dispute. Because of that, Genesis on a very practical level has immense implications and application for us here today. The impact is huge. The importance of this is huge. Could it be that believing in this Genesis story, this Genesis origin story, could it be that believing in this as the inspired word of God can change the way that we see the world? Could it be that believing in this story written by the hand of Moses, inspired by God, can equip us today at an absolute bare minimum to have a reason for living, believing, and looking forward? I ask you again, how many times do people feel like they don't know where they're going? They don't know why they're here. They don't know what their purpose is. They don't feel like they have any value. There's hundreds of thousands, millions of people out in the world who struggle with these kinds of things. But there's a belief system and there's a principle hidden in this book of Genesis that disputes all of that for good. And it shows us that we are here with purpose. We are here for a reason, that every single one of us has value and worth. And for people who are struggling and going through hard times, sometimes that's all they need to hear, is that they're still here for a reason and that they matter. Amazing. It's amazing. Now, to kind of wrap it up, this is just an intro to Genesis. We haven't even talked about the first verse or anything yet. This is just the intro in the background, understanding the context. But again, realizing how important this is for people here today and not just the Israelites who first received this text back then thousands of years ago. It's huge. And here, to continue to make the bridge, the Genesis Church Fellowship, our theme for the year is coming home. And you think about that concept of coming home. If you don't know where you come from, then why would you be interested in going home? If you don't know what your origin is, does going home even mean anything? I would argue that it doesn't. But I think that speaks to the importance of the argument of understanding why it's necessary to know where we come from. Because knowing where we come from and the intention that we're here, that we have purpose, that we have value, and it comes from this place where we were created from, we can be drawn back to that. and will want to go home back to that place that gave us that value, that gave us that purpose, if we can believe in that and if we can see the reality of that. So the beauty in just understanding the context of Genesis, it's a real simple beauty. It's understanding that we're all here for a reason. It's understanding that we're here on purpose. We're not accidents. We are not divine afterthoughts. We're here for a purpose, on purpose. And perhaps the greatest beauty of all is that in God we can find it. Because He's the one behind all of this. He's the one who can give us meaning through all of this. That's the same thing that He did for Israel back then. He gave them meaning. He gave them purpose and value in a situation that they didn't have any. And He spoke into that to do something special for them. And that's the same thing that God wants to do for us. I'm going to leave it there. That was the first lesson. We ain't even touched Genesis yet. We're just talking about the background and the context. But it's lunchtime. It's like 2:41 out here. I was supposed to be at the house like an hour and a half ago. I'm going to go eat. But hey, let me know what you think down below. Let me know what you think about the debate between the different creation myths, the legends, what you think about the disputes of God's purpose and intention. If you disagree, doesn't matter. This is an open forum. Let me know what you think down below. But yeah, I'm gonna go eat. Thanks for tuning in and watching this far, if you've done it. And next time, we're gonna talk about Genesis 1 verse 1. That's it. Genesis 1 verse 1. And we'll build on this because there's so much beauty here in just the first few verses of Genesis. I promise you, you'll see something that you probably haven't seen before. So, hey man, we out here and we out. I'll catch you in the next one.